Victoria adjusted the patient's blanket, the soft beeping of the heart monitor filling the quiet hospital room. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting golden hues across the sterile walls. Her phone vibrated on the counter, pulling her from the moment. Andrew. Don't forget about dinner at Mom's tonight. Final meeting before Rebecca's wedding. Victoria exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. Another evening with Patricia Dawson, her mother-in-law, and her harshest critic. 5 years of marriage hadn't softened Patricia's disdain for her. As a prominent socialite from Boston's elite circles, Patricia had never quite forgiven her son for marrying a mere nurse. Victoria's long shifts during the pandemic had only solidified her mother-in-law's belief that she was too common for the Dawson name. And of course, there was the unspoken disappointment. No grandchildren yet. Patricia never missed a chance to bring up the family legacy. By the time they pulled into the driveway of Patricia's sprawling Bridgewater estate, Rebecca's sleek Mercedes was already parked out front. Inside, Patricia and Rebecca lounged on the velvet settee, flipping through wedding arrangements. Patricia barely looked up, her smile thin. "Oh, you finally made it." "Andrew's still at work," Victoria explained. "Should we start without him?" Rebecca barely glanced in her direction as she adjusted a diamond bracelet. "We're finalizing the guest list," she said airily. "You and Andrew will be at the family table, of course." "Let me know if I can help with anything," Victoria offered. Rebecca's smile was swift and dismissive. "The planner has it covered. Just show up." Victoria bit the inside of her cheek, swallowing her pride as the conversation drifted to the importance of the Stanford family name, her future brother-in-law's esteemed lineage. The walls of the living room were lined with portraits of the Dawson family, each one carefully framed and displayed with reverence. But Victoria and Andrew's wedding photo? A small, unassuming frame pushed off to the side, barely noticeable. As dinner wrapped up, Patricia delicately placed her wine glass down and turned to Victoria. "By the way, I could use a little extra help this month," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of entitlement that barely disguised itself as a request. "Rebecca's wedding has brought in some unforeseen expenses." Victoria's jaw tightened. Patricia had been receiving financial help from them ever since Andrew's father passed, but it was never enough. It was never optional. Before Victoria could respond, Frances, the housekeeper, quietly approached her. "Mrs. Dawson, what time will the staff be arriving for the wedding rehearsal tomorrow?" Victoria frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm a guest, Frances." Frances looked stricken. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I just assumed—" "Madam mentioned—" Victoria didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew. The ride home was silent. She stared out the window, the blurred streetlights reflecting the truth she had ignored for too long. No matter what she did, she would always be an outsider to them. But something shifted in her that night. The day of the wedding arrived with crisp autumn air and a sky painted in shades of sapphire. Victoria smoothed the fabric of her navy blue dress, elegant but understated, a deliberate choice to avoid another one of Patricia's passive-aggressive remarks. Andrew squeezed her shoulders, offering her a reassuring smile. "You look beautiful. Let's go. Mom will have a fit if we're late." As they pulled up to the Windsor, a luxury hotel reserved for Boston's elite, Victoria took a steadying breath. Fancy cars lined the lot, gleaming under the midday sun. This was just one day. She could handle it. Inside, the lobby glowed with opulence, grand chandeliers, floral arrangements that likely cost more than her monthly mortgage. As they approached the check-in table, a well-dressed attendant greeted them. "Mr. and Mrs. Dawson," Andrew announced. The woman scanned the list and handed over 2 name tags. Her smile practiced. "Mr. Andrew Dawson and Miss Victoria Dawson. Here are your name tags. Please wear them on the left side of your chest." Victoria reached for hers absent-mindedly, pinning it as she glanced down, and then she froze. Victoria Dawson, housekeeper. For a split second, the world around her blurred. The murmur of polite chatter faded. The clinking of glasses at the nearby bar dulled. She blinked, once, twice, convinced she was seeing it wrong. But no, there it was, housekeeper. A cold realization settled over her. They hadn't just dismissed her. They had humiliated her, deliberately, publicly. She slowly lifted her gaze, scanning the room. Rebecca, across the hall, was already laughing, whispering into Patricia's ear. Patricia, for her part, simply lifted her wine glass in silent mockery, her lips curling into an amused smirk. The final straw. Victoria unclipped the name tag, letting it drop onto the polished floor. Then, with absolute calm, she turned on her heel and walked out. Victoria stared at the name tag in her trembling hands, the weight of its implication sinking in like a stone dropped into deep water. Victoria Dawson, housekeeper. Beside her, Andrew was still inspecting his own tag. Andrew Dawson, Patricia Dawson's son, oblivious to the gut-wrenching humiliation unraveling in front of them. "Is there a problem?" The familiar, clipped voice sent a shiver down Victoria's spine. She turned to find Patricia standing behind them, draped in an elegant lavender dress, a glass of champagne poised delicately in her manicured hand. The satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable. Victoria swallowed hard, steadying her voice. "There must be a mistake with my name tag." Patricia tilted her head, pretending to study the small plastic badge. "A mistake," she echoed, her tone laced with feigned innocence. "I was under the impression this was correct. After all, isn't that what you are to this family?" The words sliced through Victoria like a sharpened blade. Around them, guests exchanged amused glances, whispering behind raised glasses. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she willed herself not to let them see her falter. "What the hell is this?" Andrew finally caught on, his voice low and sharp as he grabbed his mother's arm. "This isn't funny, Mother. Fix it. Now." Victoria placed a hand on his wrist, stopping him. "No, Andrew." Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Today is Rebecca's day. Let's not make a scene." Patricia's lips curled into a slow, victorious smile. "A wise choice," she murmured before turning on her heel. "Now let's head inside. The Stanfords are waiting." Andrew looked as though he wanted to argue, his jaw clenched so tightly that Victoria thought he might crack a tooth. But she squeezed his hand, silently pleading with him. "Not here. Not now." The ceremony proceeded in a blur. Rebecca, draped in lace and pearls, was the picture of bridal perfection. Michael, dashing in his tailored suit, gazed at her with nothing short of adoration. It was a beautiful event, but Victoria felt none of it. She could feel Patricia's eyes on her throughout the vows, the reception, the speeches. A cold, lingering reminder that no matter how much time passed, she would never be one of them. The ballroom was extravagant, flawlessly arranged with gold-trimmed tables, sparkling chandeliers, and a live orchestra playing a soft melody. As guests filtered into their assigned seats, Victoria and Andrew were directed to the family table. "Are you okay?" Andrew whispered as they sat down. Victoria forced a smile. "I'll try not to let it bother me." The evening carried on. Toasts were made, and laughter filled the grand room. Waiters swept through the tables, elegantly placing plated courses before each guest. Victoria watched as wine was poured, delicate entrees set before Andrew, Patricia, and the others. But nothing arrived for her. Her stomach twisted, an icy realization washing over her. She waited. Perhaps it was an oversight, but when the third course was served, her plate remained empty. She caught the eye of a passing waiter. "Excuse me, I think my meal was missed. The waiter hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I was given specific instructions. Before Victoria could respond, Rebecca appeared beside her, a smirk playing on her perfectly painted lips. Something wrong? She asked sweetly. Victoria turned to face her, keeping her expression calm. Why are you doing this? Rebecca's eyes gleamed with cruelty as she leaned in, her voice just above a whisper. Meals are only for real family. People like you don't count. Something inside Victoria snapped. Every offhand remark, every dismissive glance, every carefully orchestrated slight had led to this moment. For years, she had endured the whispered insults, the veiled contempt. She had let them treat her as lesser, all for the sake of keeping the peace. But no more. With quiet precision, she placed her napkin on the table and stood. The chatter around her hushed as guests turned to watch. If that's how you feel, she said, her voice calm but resolute, then I shouldn't be here. Patricia straightened in her seat, her eyes narrowing. Victoria, don't be ridiculous. Victoria reached for her left hand, her fingers grazing the cool metal of her wedding ring. Slowly, deliberately, she slid it off. The tiny silver band clinked against the marble tabletop as she set it down. If I'm not real family, then there's no reason for me to stay. A stunned silence fell over the room. Rebecca's smug expression faltered. Michael's mother, Eleanor Stanford, stiffened, looking visibly displeased. Across the hall, Andrew was rushing back from the groom's table, his eyes darting between the ring on the table and his wife standing tall, unwavering. Victoria, wait, Andrew called, his voice desperate. But she didn't stop. Patricia rose halfway from her chair, her composure finally cracking. It was just a joke. Don't be so dramatic. Victoria didn't turn back. She walked out of the grand ballroom, her spine straight, her head high. The moment she pushed open the heavy doors, the crisp night air filled her lungs, washing away the weight of years of silent suffering. For the first time since marrying into the Dawson family, she felt free. As Victoria stepped onto the sidewalk, her fingers hovering over her phone to call a taxi, the sound of hurried footsteps made her pause. Turning, she saw Eleanor Stanford approaching, her expression unreadable beneath the glow of the hotel's entrance lights. Wait. Eleanor's voice was calm but firm as she reached out and gently grasped Victoria's arm. What happened tonight was disgraceful. Patricia and Rebecca's behavior was beyond cruel, and frankly, I have no words for it. Victoria swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. Thank you, Eleanor, but I can't stay here, not after this. Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady. I understand, but Victoria, remember this. You handled this with dignity and strength. Don't let them take that away from you. For the first time that night, Victoria felt the tightness in her chest ease, if only slightly. She managed a small smile. That means a lot. With that, she called a taxi and left, the hotel shrinking behind her as she drove away from the humiliation, the whispers, and the family that had never truly welcomed her. Inside the venue, an uneasy tension settled over the ballroom. Guests exchanged glances, their murmurs growing louder as the weight of what had just happened spread through the room. Andrew returned to the family table, confusion etched across his face. His eyes landed on the wedding band. Resting on the table, the ring Victoria had worn for 5 years. A sudden coldness gripped his chest. Where's Victoria? His voice was sharp, urgent. Patricia, ever composed, forced a tight smile. Just a misunderstanding, dear. She'll be back shortly. Before she could continue, Eleanor stepped forward, her tone icy. No, Patricia, this was not a misunderstanding. I saw what you and Rebecca did to Victoria, and I have never been more appalled." Andrew's gaze darted to the name tag still in his hand. Victoria Dawson, Housekeeper. His stomach twisted. His grip on the card tightened as his fury rose. "What did you do?" His voice was no longer calm. Michael, who had been chatting with a guest, finally took notice of the growing tension. He moved toward Rebecca, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, the color draining from her face. "It was just a joke," she said dismissively. Victoria overreacted. Michael's expression darkened. "A joke? Publicly humiliating someone and depriving them of a meal is a joke to you." The room grew quieter as the weight of the confrontation settled. Even Michael's father, who had remained silent throughout the evening, now rose from his seat and directed a cold stare at Patricia. "This behavior is unacceptable." His voice was low but carried through the hall. "Our family values respect and dignity. I cannot allow us to be associated with people who treat others so cruelly." Eleanor stepped beside her husband, nodding. "Until further notice, we are withholding our support for this marriage." Rebecca gasped. "But this is my wedding." Michael's jaw tightened as he pulled his hand away from hers. "Rebecca, if this is the kind of person you are, maybe we need to rethink everything." Andrew had already stopped listening. He turned, name tag clenched in his fist, and strode out of the hall without another word. Meanwhile, outside, a hotel staff member helped Victoria into a taxi. Andrew sprinted toward his car, his mind racing as he gripped the steering wheel and sped toward home. Regret clawed at his throat. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have seen this coming. I should have protected her. When Victoria arrived home, she hesitated at the door. The house, their house, had always been a place of love, of warmth. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a place filled with unanswered questions, broken trust, and an ache she wasn't sure could be soothed. She stepped inside, closed the door, and let the weight of everything crash over her. For the first time that night, she let herself cry. 20 minutes later, the front door swung open, and Andrew rushed in, his chest rising and falling from the sprint up the stairs. "Victoria!" His voice cracked with emotion as he spotted her curled up on the couch. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed, and the sight of her pain sent another wave of anger rolling through him. Anger at his mother, at Rebecca, and most of all, at himself for not protecting her. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "What they did tonight was inexcusable. You're the most important person in my life, and I am so, so sorry." Victoria clenched her fists against his shirt. "Why do I always feel like an outsider, Andrew? Even after all these years?" He pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. "You're not an outsider. Not to me. You're my wife. You're my family. And I won't let them treat you like this ever again." Victoria searched his face, trying to find truth in his words, and found only sincerity. But the wounds were still fresh, the pain still raw. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Andrew's expression hardened with resolve. "First, I'm cutting my mother off financially. I won't keep funding her lifestyle while she treats you like a disposable inconvenience." Victoria's eyes widened in surprise. "But Patricia—" "She'll deal with the consequences of her actions," Andrew interrupted. "She has plenty of assets. She'll be fine, just not in the way she's used to. I won't let her manipulate us anymore." Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The ache in her chest remained, but a small ember of hope flickered beneath it. "And what about our relationship with them?" she asked carefully. "We keep our distance," Andrew said firmly, "until they realize what they've done and truly apologize. But until then, we focus on us." For the first time that night, Victoria exhaled, releasing some of the tension she'd carried. Andrew brushed a strand of hair from her face. And in the meantime, how about a weekend getaway? Just the two of us. I know a quiet cottage on the Maine coast. A small smile tugged at Victoria's lips. That actually sounds perfect. As the night deepened and the city hummed softly outside their window, the wounds of the evening remained. But within their home, within each other, something new was growing, something stronger. And for the first time in years, Victoria allowed herself to believe that she wasn't alone in this fight. Victoria's lips curled into a faint smile as she glanced out the window, the golden morning sunlight spilling over the flower beds in their yard. A new day had begun, yet the weight of yesterday's humiliation still lingered in her heart. And yet, there was something else too, an unfamiliar but undeniable sense of freedom. She had drawn a line. She had chosen herself. Andrew's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. "Ready?" he asked. Turning to face him, she met his steady gaze and nodded. "Let's go." As they stepped outside, the crisp morning air felt invigorating, as though it carried the promise of a fresh start. Andrew grabbed the mail from the box on their way to the car. Among the usual envelopes was one marked with Michael's name. Victoria opened it as they pulled out of the driveway, her eyes scanning the carefully written words. "Victoria, I am truly sorry for what happened. The way Rebecca and her family treated you was unacceptable, and I should have intervened sooner. After much discussion, my parents have decided that we cannot move forward with the wedding under these circumstances. I've told Rebecca she needs to seriously reflect on her actions. I respect the way you stood up for yourself, wishing you both safe travels." Victoria read the letter twice before passing it to Andrew, who remained silent as he drove toward the Maine coast. For the next week, they let the ocean winds and the quiet serenity of the shoreline mend the wounds left by betrayal. The days passed in a tranquil rhythm. Morning coffee by the waves, long walks along the cliffs, and quiet evenings curled up together by the fireplace. No calls, no messages, no obligations, just them. But the outside world refused to be ignored. During a slow morning breakfast in their small cottage, Andrew's phone vibrated against the wooden table. He glanced at the screen and exhaled sharply. "Mom, again." Victoria set her fork down, watching the sea breeze stir the lace curtains. "How many calls now?" "10th one since yesterday," Andrew muttered, rubbing his temple. "Rebecca's been texting too." Victoria handed him her phone, the screen lit with unread messages. "Same here." Rebecca's last message stood out among the others. "Victoria, please, call me. I'm sorry." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, seagulls called over the waves, the wind rustling the trees. "Do you think they're actually sorry?" Victoria asked, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Andrew let out a slow breath. "I don't know. Maybe they just want to fix their reputations." She nodded. "Either way, I guess we can't ignore them forever." "No," he agreed, "but not yet." On their final morning in Maine, as Andrew returned the cottage keys, he came back looking puzzled, a newspaper tucked under his arm. "What is it?" Victoria asked, noting the strange look on his face. "The owner mentioned something interesting in today's paper," he said, unfolding it. "Take a look." Victoria's eyes widened as she read the headline. "Stanford's Launch Healthcare Initiative, New Fund to Support Medical Professionals." Her pulse quickened. The article detailed how Jonathan Sinclair's parents had announced a charity fund to support healthcare workers who had sacrificed so much during the pandemic. Eleanor Stanford's quote stood out. "It is time we honor the real heroes, the ones who serve with quiet strength, expecting nothing in return." Victoria's fingers tightened around the newspaper. Is this about me? Andrew placed a hand on her back. I can't say for sure, but the timing is interesting, don't you think? They left it unspoken, but as they packed up and drove home, the weight of what had happened and what was still to come settled between them. Back at their house, the mailbox was full. Among the letters were 2 from the Stanford family. One, an official notice of the postponed wedding. The other, a private apology addressed to Victoria. 3 weeks later, Victoria returned to work. Her co-workers noticed something different about her. An unshakable confidence, a quiet resolve. She carried herself differently now, no longer bending under the weight of others' expectations. Then one evening, as she walked out of the hospital toward her car, she spotted a familiar vehicle. Her steps slowed as she saw Patricia Dawson standing by the passenger side. Patricia looked different. Gone was the carefully curated elegance, the air of superiority. She wore simple clothes, her makeup minimal, and for the first time she looked small, almost fragile. Victoria, Patricia's voice trembled. Could we talk? Victoria paused, studying her mother-in-law's face. The sharp edges of arrogance were gone, replaced by something raw. After a moment, she gave a small nod. All right. They walked to a nearby cafe, settling into a quiet corner. Patricia ordered coffee but barely touched it. Her hands trembled slightly as she laced them together on the table. My actions were unforgivable, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I let my pride blind me. I never saw you for who you truly are. I only saw who I wanted my son to marry, not the woman who loves him. Victoria studied her, trying to decipher whether this was just another performance. But there was no grandeur in Patricia's tone, no expectation of absolution, just regret. Have you spoken with the Stanford family? Patricia asked hesitantly. Victoria nodded. Yes, I've heard from Michael and his parents. Patricia flinched, as though bracing for what that meant. But for the first time, Victoria wasn't the one waiting for approval. She was the one who would decide where things went from here. Patricia's smile was bittersweet, a far cry from the arrogant smirk she once wore. They've completely cut ties with us, she admitted, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. Michael told Rebecca he would reconsider only if she truly changes, but she exhaled, shaking her head. And Rebecca? Victoria asked cautiously. Patricia hesitated before answering. She's finally beginning to reflect. For the first time, she's considering how her actions have affected others. A quiet fell between them, the hum of traffic and murmurs of cafe patrons filling the silence. Then, as if steeling herself for what came next, Patricia spoke again. I'm selling the house. Victoria blinked, caught off guard. Without Andrew's financial support, I can't maintain that lifestyle. I'm moving into a small apartment. The admission shocked Victoria. The Patricia she had known would have clung to her social status with an iron grip, and yet here she was, willingly letting it go. Victoria took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Patricia, I might be able to forgive you, but trust will take time to rebuild. Patricia nodded. I understand. I just want a chance. With both of you, I want to do better. That night, Victoria recounted the conversation to Andrew. He listened in silence before finally nodding. Let's meet with her, he decided. But she needs to understand. Things will never go back to the way they were. The following weekend, they visited Patricia's new apartment. It was modest, a stark contrast to her previous opulence. Yet when she welcomed them inside, she did so with a genuine warmth that Victoria had never seen before. Did you cook this yourself? Andrew asked, eyeing the neatly set table with disbelief. Patricia flushed slightly. I've been learning through YouTube. I'm not very good yet, but I'm trying. Conversation was slow at first, but as the meal went on, it softened into something real. Patricia opened up about her past mistakes, admitting how blinded she had been by status and wealth. "I've spent my whole life measuring people by the wrong things," she confessed, "but none of that matters now." Victoria saw it then. This wasn't an act. Something had shifted within Patricia. "And Rebecca?" Andrew asked. "She's struggling," Patricia admitted. "Michael has given her time, but I think she knows she has to change." As they prepared to leave, Patricia pressed a small box into Victoria's hands. "Open it later," she whispered. Back home, Victoria lifted the lid to find a delicate silver bracelet, the engraving catching the light. "Family is bound by love, not blood." Patricia's voice lingered in her mind. "I still have a lot to learn. But Victoria, I want to understand what it means to be family." From that moment, things began to shift, slowly, carefully. Andrew resumed some financial support for Patricia, but only for essentials. She accepted it without protest and worked to simplify her life. A month later, Rebecca reached out. This time, she wasn't defensive or dismissive. "I'll regret that day for the rest of my life," she admitted, voice quiet. "I never realized how shallow I was. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to be better." Victoria studied her for a long moment before offering a small nod. "People can change, Rebecca." "We'll see." As autumn deepened, the entire family agreed to seek therapy together. The first session was tense, but it was a step toward something healthier. One crisp evening, Victoria and Andrew sat on their porch, golden leaves swirling in the wind. "I never thought a day that humiliating would lead to this," Victoria murmured, resting her head on his shoulder. Andrew tightened his hold around her. "Because you stood your ground, Victoria. You changed everything." For the first time in years, she felt a quiet kind of hope. A year later, they hosted a small backyard barbecue, the scent of grilled food drifting through the air. Victoria placed a hand on her growing belly, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she finished setting the table. She and Andrew were 6 months pregnant, eagerly awaiting the arrival of their first child. "Don't carry that," Patricia fretted, hurrying over to take the fruit tray from her hands. "Leave it to me." Victoria chuckled. "Thank you, Patricia." Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it had evolved into something built on mutual respect. Nearby, Rebecca and Michael sat together, their wedding 6 months past. Unlike before, Rebecca had let go of the need for extravagance, choosing instead an intimate ceremony filled with sincerity. Rebecca approached Victoria, hesitating before asking, "How's the baby?" Victoria smiled, resting a hand over her belly. "Very active." For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Under the soft glow of twilight, Victoria rested a hand on her belly and chuckled. She has a habit of kicking right in the middle of the night. Across the yard, Andrew tended to the grill, his eyes lingering on the sight before him, his mother and sister, not just tolerating Victoria, but truly engaging with her. It was a scene he never thought possible. Michael, lifting his glass, offered a toast to strong family bonds. Glasses clinked in unison as everyone echoed, "To family." Victoria smiled, raising her own glass of sparkling cider. After dinner, Patricia approached Victoria, a small, neatly wrapped package in her hands. She hesitated before offering it. "I made this for the baby." Victoria carefully unwrapped the gift and gasped softly. Inside was a delicate hand-knitted baby blanket, the stitches slightly uneven but full of warmth. "It's not perfect," Patricia admitted, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "but I put my heart into it." Emotion swelled in Victoria's chest as she stepped forward and embraced her mother-in-law. "It's beautiful. Thank you." The evening stretched on, laughter and conversation weaving effortlessly through the cool air. The garden lights flickered as the first stars began to dot the night sky. Andrew settled beside Victoria, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Looking back, that wedding changed everything. Victoria nodded, her gaze soft. It was painful, but sometimes growth comes from the hardest moments. Across the table, Patricia listened, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet but firm voice, she finally said, "I understand now. Family isn't just blood, it's respect, love, and the choices we make every day." For the first time, Victoria truly believed her. As the evening faded into night, she looked around and saw not perfection, but something even better, something real. This wasn't the story she had imagined, but it was one built on truth, healing, and the kind of love that was finally earned.